They called it our thing. A brotherhood born in blood, and buried by betrayal. In the shadows of Sicily, power had no face. Only silence, loyalty, and death. Italy, mid-1800s. Sicily, isolated, poor, and forgotten by its own government. Foreign rulers had come and gone, Spanish, French, Bourbon kings, all leaving behind a population starving for power and dignity. In that desperation, something took root. Groups of peasants and small landowners formed secret societies to protect themselves from corrupt officials and bandits. They called it Cosa Nostra, our thing. At first, it was survival. They defended the weak when the state could not. But protection soon became extortion. Justice turned into control. By the time Italy unified in 1861, the Mafia already ruled large parts of Sicily, not through law, but through silence, intimidation, and a sacred code called omerta. The Mafia had no written laws, only rituals. A new member was baptized into the family in blood. His finger was pricked with a needle, and crimson drops fell onto a holy image. The picture burned in his hands as he swore an oath. As this image burns, so shall I burn if I betray my oath. In that moment, the man ceased to exist as an individual. He became property of the family. His life, his death, his silence, all belonged to Cosa Nostra. These men saw themselves not as criminals but as men of honor. Their loyalty wasn't to God or nation, but to their boss, their brothers, and their code. Through the late 1800s and early 1900s, Cosa Nostra grew quietly. They became middlemen between the poor and the powerful. Landowners hired them to protect estates. Politicians bought their influence. And soon, no deal, no trade, no favor in Sicily could pass without their blessing. Every wedding, every funeral, every market whispered their presence. To cross them was to vanish. To speak of them was to die. This was not crime. It was order, their order. And it was sealed with blood. By the early 1900s, the Mafia's influence had spread beyond the countryside. They infiltrated the ports, the banks, and even the local governments. Judges, police chiefs, and mayors owed them favors, or feared their wrath. The Mafia didn't need to overthrow the state. They simply became part of it. It was a quiet kind of domination, handshakes instead of bullets, bribes instead of blood. But behind every deal and every smile lay a threat, silent but deadly. As Italy modernized, one man rose who saw them for what they truly were, a rival to his absolute power. His name was Benito Mussolini. When Mussolini seized control in the 1920s, he promised to crush the Mafia once and for all. To him, no power could exist above the state, not the church, not the aristocrats, and certainly not Cosa Nostra. He sent Cesare Mori, the Iron Prefect, to Sicily with full authority. Mori's forces raided entire towns, dragged suspects from their homes, and tortured confessions out of them. For the first time, the Mafia was on the run. Many fled overseas, to the United States, where they found a new world ready for the taking. Mori's campaign was brutal, but effective. By the mid-1930s, Mussolini declared Sicily purified. But history would soon prove, he had only cut the weed, not killed the root. Across the Atlantic, the Mafia was reborn. In the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, Sicilian families built new networks that mirrored Cosa Nostra's ancient code. They started small, running speakeasies, protection rackets, and gambling rings. But soon, prohibition turned them into kings. Names like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Al Capone rose from the shadows. They built empires on bootlegging and bribery, mixing blood with business. The American Mafia didn't forget its roots. They kept close ties with the old families in Sicily, shipping profits and power back across the sea. When World War II erupted, that connection became official. The U.S. Navy, desperate to secure New York's docks from sabotage, made a secret deal with Lucky Luciano. Cosa Nostra would protect the ports, in exchange for Luciano's reduced prison sentence. That pact marked the moment the Mafia transformed from street thugs to political players. By the end of the war, American and Sicilian networks were working hand in hand, moving heroin, laundering money, and controlling entire ports across the Mediterranean. The Mafia had gone global. What began in the alleys of Palermo was now an empire stretching from Sicily to Brooklyn, bound by loyalty, money, and murder. When World War II ended, Italy lay in ruins. Cities bombed, governments fractured, millions desperate for food and work. And in that chaos, the Mafia returned, stronger, smarter, richer. The Allies, seeking stability, unknowingly reopened old wounds. They restored many Sicilian leaders who had once been jailed by Mussolini, men who were, in truth, Mafia dons. Within months, the old families re-emerged, slipping quietly into the new political order. Black markets flourished. Food, fuel, and medicine were stolen, sold, and controlled by the clans. The Mafia became the silent engine of reconstruction, dictating who got jobs, who got contracts, and who disappeared for asking questions. By the 1950s, names like Calogero Vizzini and Giuseppe Genco Russo were spoken with both respect and fear. They sat at the tables of bishops and ministers, photographed in fine suits beside political leaders who owed them everything. It was a new kind of Mafia, businessmen by day, killers by night. The lines between state and syndicate blurred until they were one and the same. The poor called them men of honor. The powerful called them partners. And the truth, whispered only in dark corners, was that Sicily's future once again belonged to the shadow. By the early 1960s, the Mafia's golden era of silent control began to crumble. Money, more than loyalty, became the new god. And nothing brought more money than heroin. As international trade routes expanded, Sicilian families fought to dominate the flow of drugs between Turkey, Italy, and the United States. The profits were astronomical. But greed breeds blood. The fragile balance between families shattered. The result was the First Mafia War. In Palermo, car bombs ripped through crowded streets. Gunmen ambushed rivals in restaurants, at funerals, even outside churches. Bodies piled up faster than investigators could count. The violence reached its peak in 1963 with the Sicily massacre. A car bomb meant for a rival boss detonated near a police checkpoint, killing 7 officers. The blast shook Sicily, and the nation's faith in its leaders. For the first time, the public demanded action. The Italian government launched an all-out war on the Mafia, arresting thousands across the island. But arrests meant nothing without testimony. No one talked. No one betrayed the code. Omerta held like stone. When the smoke cleared, the Mafia had lost men, but not power. They had learned a lesson: the less the world saw, the more control they kept. By the 1970s, the Mafia had learned a deadly truth. Violence attracted attention, but money bought power. They moved quietly into construction, banking, and politics. No longer street thugs with knives, they were now businessmen in tailored suits, shaking hands with ministers and financiers. Newspapers called it the system. A network of mob bosses, corrupt officials, and white-collar criminals who ran Italy's economy from the shadows. Billions flowed through Mafia-controlled construction projects. Entire neighborhoods were built on bribes. And when journalists asked too many questions, their cars exploded on quiet suburban streets. But beneath this polished new facade lurked monsters. A new generation of bosses was rising, cold, cunning, and merciless. The most feared among them, Salvatore Toto Riina, from the small Sicilian town of Corleone. Riina didn't believe in alliances, he believed in domination. He declared war not only on rival clans but on anyone who stood in his way: politicians, priests, even judges. Under his command, Palermo became a battlefield once more. Only this time, it wasn't about territory, it was about control of the nation's soul. The Mafia had become a government within the government. And Riina was its invisible king. From the small rural town of Corleone came a man who would redefine fear itself: Salvatore Toto Riina. He grew up poor, hardened by hunger and violence, and by the 1970s, he had become the most feared boss in Sicily. Riina didn't care about tradition or negotiation. He ruled through terror. He believed that power wasn't something you inherited, it was something you took. He waged war on every rival, turning the mafia inward, a purge that left hundreds dead. Under his command, even the old bosses who had ruled for decades were hunted down like animals. Anyone who opposed him vanished, their bodies never found. Palermo became a city under siege. Car bombs exploded in daylight. Judges, journalists, and police officers were executed in front of their families. Fear spread like smoke through every street, every cafe, every home. For Riina, it was simple. If fear kept men silent, then fear was loyalty. By the 1980s, his Corleonesi faction had conquered all of Sicily. Politicians, businessmen, and police chiefs bowed quietly. Those who didn't, died. Toto Riina had become the boss of bosses. And in his rise, the mafia had become something far darker than it had ever been before. A regime of terror disguised as honor. While fear gripped Sicily, two men refused to kneel. Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, childhood friends turned prosecutors, made it their life's mission to expose Cosa Nostra from the inside out. They studied the mafia not as criminals, but as a system. Falcone once said, "Follow the money, and you'll find the truth." Together, they built the Anti-Mafia Pool, a revolutionary team that operated in secrecy and unity, so no one could be singled out and killed alone. They mapped out the mafia's structure, the bosses, the lieutenants, the soldiers. They uncovered names politicians swore didn't exist. Their work led to the Maxi trial in 1986, the largest criminal trial in history. A fortress-like courtroom was built to hold over 475 mafia members. For 2 years, the world watched as the code of silence cracked for the first time. When the verdicts came, 19 bosses received life sentences. Cosa Nostra had been struck at its core. But Falcone and Borsellino knew victory would make them targets. They continued their work anyway. Because to them, justice wasn't an option. It was duty. And duty, in the face of death, was the purest form of courage. The mafia never forgives. And it never forgets. In 1992, Italy was about to learn that truth in the most brutal way possible. On May 23, Giovanni Falcone, his wife Francesca, and 3 bodyguards were traveling on the highway near Capaci, outside Palermo. Hidden beneath the road was a half-ton of explosives, triggered remotely as his convoy passed. The blast tore through concrete and steel, throwing cars into the air like toys. The explosion could be heard for miles. Falcone was killed instantly. The nation froze in horror. But the mafia wasn't done. Just 57 days later, Paolo Borsellino, Falcone's closest friend, met the same fate. A car bomb detonated outside his mother's house in Palermo, killing him and 5 bodyguards. 2 men who had spent their lives fighting silence were now silenced themselves. The streets they had tried to cleanse ran red once again. But this time, the killings had gone too far. Italy erupted. Millions marched in protest. Citizens filled the squares of Palermo and Rome, chanting their names, lighting candles, demanding justice. The mafia had won its revenge. But in doing so, it had awakened a nation. Falcone and Borsellino's deaths shook Italy to its core. For years, the mafia had thrived in the shadows, protected by fear and silence. But this time, the people had seen too much. The assassinations became the turning point in Italy's war against organized crime. The government, backed by the fury of millions, unleashed Operation Clean Hands. It was a sweeping investigation into corruption at every level, from mafia bosses to ministers in Rome. For the first time in history, the walls protecting Cosa Nostra began to crack. Dozens of high-ranking members turned informant. Money trails exposed secret accounts and political deals. The state finally struck back, hard. And then, in January 1993, after 23 years on the run, Toto Riina was captured in Palermo. He had lived for decades as a ghost, hidden in plain sight, protected by silence and fear. When police raided his hideout, they found him calm, smirking, as if daring them to believe that his capture meant victory. Riina was sentenced to life in prison. But even behind bars, his influence lingered. The mafia's body was bleeding, but its heart still beat. Still, that day, when the boss of bosses was finally led away in handcuffs, Italy felt something it hadn't in generations. Hope. After Toto Riina's arrest, the mafia began to devour itself from within. For decades, silence had been their armor. Now, that silence was breaking. One by one, mafia soldiers began to talk, the pentiti, the repentants. Men who had killed for the family now confessed in courtrooms, trading secrets for survival. Among them was Tommaso Buscetta, the first high-ranking boss to turn state witness. His testimony opened the eyes of the world to Cosa Nostra's inner machinery, its codes, its hierarchies, its rituals of blood. He revealed how the mafia controlled politicians, judges, even parts of the church. How money flowed from murder to government contracts, from heroin routes to Vatican banks. Each confession tore another piece from the mafia's veil of invincibility. The code of omerta, once sacred, was crumbling. Men who had lived by it now betrayed their brothers to save their own lives. Inside prisons across Italy, whispers became evidence, and evidence became trials. The mafia's greatest weapon, silence, had turned into its own executioner. But betrayal came at a cost. Those who spoke never walked free again. They lived under false names, forever hunted by the ghosts of the family they had abandoned. By the early 2000s, the mafia had changed its face. Gone were the car bombs, shootouts, and public executions. The new bosses understood something their predecessors didn't: true power doesn't need to be seen. They traded bullets for balance sheets. Violence for influence. The mafia had become invisible. Their money flowed through real estate, shipping, and luxury hotels. Their soldiers wore suits, not leather jackets. The drug routes still ran, but now the profits were laundered through legitimate companies and offshore accounts. The families had evolved into corporations, silent partners in the global economy. The 'Ndrangheta of Calabria, the Camorra of Naples, and the remnants of Cosa Nostra in Sicily learned to work together, adapting to a modern world where crime didn't need gunfire, only signatures and secrecy. But beneath the respectability, the old code endured. The same values of loyalty, silence, and revenge ran through their veins. A betrayal could still mean death, only now, it came quietly. A missing businessman. A suicide with too many questions. A deal that went wrong and was never spoken of again. The mafia had entered the new millennium not as a ghost of the past, but as a shadow in plain sight. Italy's war with the mafia was never just about crime. It was about the nation's soul. Every generation produced new soldiers, not of the mafia, but of justice. Journalists, judges, police officers, and ordinary citizens who refused to be silent. In Palermo, murals of Falcone and Borsellino now cover the walls that once echoed with fear. Their faces, painted in color and light, watch over streets where children play freely, streets once soaked in blood. But even in this new era, the struggle continues. In the quiet corners of Sicily, the old loyalties still whisper. New names rise, new deals are made, and the shadow of Cosa Nostra stretches long under the Mediterranean sun. The mafia no longer needs guns to rule. It thrives on greed, silence, and the complacency of those who choose not to see. Yet hope endures. Every time a citizen speaks out, every time a journalist prints the truth, every time a family refuses to pay protection, the ghosts of the past fade a little more. The mafia's empire was built on fear. But its legacy will be defined by those brave enough to confront it. They called it Cosa Nostra, our thing. A secret brotherhood born in poverty, that came to rule through terror. A montage unfolds: empty Sicilian streets at dusk, broken wine bottles glinting under streetlights, the sea stretching endlessly beyond the cliffs. It built empires, toppled governments, and wrote its code in blood. But every empire falls. And when it does, it leaves behind ghosts. The camera pans over gravestones of fallen judges and victims, Names carved in marble, flowers withered in the sun. The Mafia didn't die. It evolved. It hides behind corporations, politics, and charity foundations. A single candle flickers before a mural of Falcone and Borsellino. Wind carries faint whispers, not of fear, but of defiance. As long as men crave power more than peace, the shadow will never fade. A pause. Then the faint echo of church bells, the same sound that opened the film, returns. Fade to black. White text appears, in memory of all who stood against the Mafia, and paid with their lives.